Hey, welcome to this session. In this session, we're going to be talking about sharing the gospel with Latter-day Saints. And really two parts of it. We're going to talk first of all about understanding LDS culture and why the culture piece matters so much. And then in the second session, we'll talk about communication and how to communicate biblical truth to Latter-day Saints. Now, Latter-day Saints, Mormons, make up 2% of the population in the United States. It's higher in some regions, especially around the West. But Mormonism is really growing in every metropolitan area. And so we want to explore ways that the religious culture of Mormonism and that Mormon identity, how it shapes how people hear the gospel and how they interact with us as traditional Christians. And then in the second part, we're going to talk about ideas on how to share the good news of God's grace in Jesus Christ in ways that actually account for that unique LDS cultural identity. And so, my name is Ross Anderson. I was born and raised as an active Latter-day Saint. I came to faith in Jesus Christ in my college years. And I've been a pastor and a church planter in Utah since 1983. Now, I've got 4 books that help you understand the kind of things I'm talking about. Let me tell you about those for just a second. The first one is called Understanding the Book of Mormon. This is an approach to the Mormon scriptures that helps us average everyday Christians to understand kind of what that book is all about and how to interact with it. The second one is called Understanding Your Mormon Neighbor. And that's a book I wrote to help Christians understand these people. Who are these people? What is their life like? How do they practice their religion? Because I wanted to move away from just having conversations between competing truth claims. And those are important conversations to be sure. But I wanted my readers to understand who these people actually are and a little bit more about their culture, their cultural identity. And then I've got one that I call Jesus Without Joseph. It's a study guide for how to follow Jesus after leaving Mormonism. So it's a Bible study guide. It's designed to be used in a small group or in a one-on-one relationship where you look up passages of the scripture and learn how then they speak, how the Bible speaks to the transition process of someone who still wants to follow Jesus but doesn't necessarily want to do that in the Mormon framework. They want to do it without the influence of Joseph Smith. And then most recently, I co-authored a book called Responding to the Mormon Missionary Message. And this is where Corey Miller and I are co-authors, and we recruited a bunch of former Mormon missionaries who are now followers of Jesus to talk about what's the curriculum that Mormon missionaries use when they come to your house. You can find out exactly all the things they're going to talk about. And we give some interaction about how to respond to those different things. But we also tell stories, and we show how the Holy Spirit is at work through Christians. We really want to use that book to encourage Christians to engage the Mormon missionaries and to engage them in a way that's actually fruitful. And so, really, let's talk for a second about the challenge and the opportunity of Mormonism. Because the challenge is like this. Mormons see Christianity as apostate. That the LDS church is the one true church. Mormonism teaches that the church that Jesus established when he first came to the earth, that was lost. It was lost because of sin and apostasy. And with it went all the authority to act in God's name on this earth. And so the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon church, they believe is the literal restoration of Jesus' lost church, all the way down from beliefs, from structure, from priesthood authority, and all the rest. That this is an exact recapitulation of the church that Jesus established. And so because of that, the Mormon church, they believe, is the one and only true and living church on the earth. They're the only ones who have the authority to perform saving ordinances. And that's why 70,000 missionaries are actively seeking to convert people out of Christian churches to join the Mormon church. They're going to say, oh yeah, we believe a lot in common. We think you're great, but we just have something more. Come and find out what that more is. And the more they're referring to is the priesthood authority. and the presence in Mormonism of ongoing revelation, of continuing revelation. So those are the things that they're trying to convert people from Christian backgrounds into Mormonism. So Mormonism has always been at odds with biblical Christianity. And yet, there's more opportunity now in our generation than there ever has been before. Because the LDS Church has attempted to be more mainstream. They've wanted to say, hey, we're just another Christian denomination. We're legitimate. We're not a cult, whatever you want to call it. Because they wanted to convert more people out of a Christian background. And so what that has done, the side effect of that, unintended on their part, is that this created new openness. It lowers the barrier on the front end so they can have more people join the church, but it also lowered the barrier on the back end so that more and more Latter-day Saints think, oh, they're just like us. Wait, they believe a lot of the same things we do. And so there's more conversations going on. They're more open to the possibility of other religions having some truth. And that's created openness. Another aspect of the opportunity is the younger generation of Mormonism is far more open to alternatives than ever have been. There's a pluralism. It's infected American culture at large, and it finally has affected Mormon culture as well. For the younger people, they're going like, oh, well, that's your truth. This is my truth. Oh, no, let's hear about your truth. They're open to alternatives. And so as a result of that, more people are leaving Mormonism than ever before. It's really a huge exodus out of Mormonism these days. And so the percentage of Mormons in Utah has gone down considerably. When I came here 40 years ago, it's about 70%. And now it's down to in the low 60%. A third of the people who are raised Mormon will eventually leave the Mormon church for one reason or another, for one destination or another. And studies have shown that a third of the people who leave the Mormon church are going to seek a new spiritual home. They're open to new spiritual opportunities. And so I want to engage those Latter-day Saint neighbors, but I want to do it in a way that's very different from the standard approach that Christians have typically used in the past. In the past, evangelical Christians have typically treated Mormonism as if it is a cult. And by certain definitions, Mormonism is a cult. It's sociologically, it meets some of the ways that cults work. They have mind control and kind of relationship control, and there's a kind of there's a penalty for people who leave and things like that. Sociologically cultish. But there's also theologically, it's a cult of Christianity, that it differs what Christians have always taught and always believed from the Bible. And I touched on this in the module on cults and apologetics. But that word cult has such a negative association that I think we ought to just ditch it. I don't think it helps our communication. It doesn't help us share the gospel with people. My goal is not to prove Mormons that they're wrong. My goal is to lead Mormons to Jesus and a real living relationship with a real Jesus Christ. Now, sometimes then we have to differ. And I'll say, here's where you're wrong. Here's where I believe I'm right. But the whole approach to the idea of a cult is such a negative approach. But it also, I want to think we should get away from it because it suggests a certain approach. There's a certain methodology that we use if we believe or we treat Mormonism as a cult. And so the typical counter-cult methods, the counter-cult apologetics, will say, let's analyze the beliefs. Let's discern where those beliefs fall short of the Bible. And then let's refute the false teaching, and we'll make a case for true beliefs. Now that approach is important. I want to be able to define where Mormonism is wrong compared to the Bible and what they believe and what we believe. But I want to also understand that counter-cult apologetics is not enough. A couple reasons why. That's not a complete or a necessarily fruitful approach because, first of all, it ignores the reasons why people are Latter-day Saints in the first place. Okay? So nobody, if you think about it, nobody is LDS because they looked at all the alternatives and they thought through the worldviews and said, oh, this one here representing by Joseph Smith, this is the best worldview I can find. This is where the truth adds up the most. Now, nobody's ever done that. People are Mormons because they're born into it. That's probably about 2/3 of Latter-day Saints are born into the Mormon church. And so they've assimilated it. They've imbibed it as part of a culture, as part of the normalcy of growing up in that world. So they haven't made a cognitive decision for it. And even if they're not born into it, even if they're a convert, they weren't converted to Mormonism because it's such a compelling worldview. Now, a lot of people, to be honest, they find that Mormonism answers difficult questions. Like, what about the fate of people who died without hearing the gospel? And what about my family and so forth? So there are some concepts in Mormonism that people find convincing, but not for cognitive reasons necessarily, for emotional reasons. And if you're a convert, you're probably joining the LDS Church because of relationship reasons as well. Maybe you met somebody, you fell in love with somebody, or you found that the LDS Church embraced you and surrounded you like family. You longed for family because you didn't have one growing up. And so all of these reasons tell me why the counter-cult approach, apologetics-only approach, actually ignores key aspects of LDS culture. And we're going to see that in a minute. So I think it's important to think about a different way to relate to Mormonism. Instead of just comparative doctrine, I want to relate to Mormonism cross-culturally. Now, let me quickly review what I said about this in the Cults and Apologetics module. If you've seen that, then this will be a review for you. The gospel is timeless. It's transcultural. The gospel is eternal. It's always true. Jesus came and died on the cross to meet the need of human race that was fallen into sin and alienated from God and all the rest. But how the gospel is communicated is going to naturally vary depending on the cultural context. Now, Christian missionaries understand this. That's why they practice what missiologists call contextualization. Contextualization means that you present the unchanging truths of the gospel in a way that makes sense within a unique or particular culture and the changing context of that culture and that worldview. Now, the biblical example of this is Paul in Acts 13 through 17 when he goes on his missionary journeys. He speaks to different audiences with different worldviews. He speaks to those audiences with different approaches. Now, for example, he spoke to faithful Jews. He spoke to rural pagans. He spoke to sophisticated urban pagans. And in each case, Paul communicated in a way that was appropriate to that cultural worldview. Different starting points, different approaches, but the presentation always moved toward Jesus and the resurrection. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Acts 13, Paul is speaking in Pisidian Antioch, part of what's now Turkey in the ancient Near East. Pisidian Antioch, there was a Jewish synagogue there, and Paul starts by entering the synagogue and beginning to make a case. He stands up, they invite him to speak. He's a well-known rabbi, and so they invite him to speak. And in Pisidian Antioch, he starts with the Jewish scriptures. And he builds on the Jewish expectation of a Messiah, the coming prophecies of a coming Messiah. And he concludes his discourse by describing how Jesus is the fulfillment of those prophecies, that Jesus is God's chosen Messiah, and that therefore they ought to put their trust in him. But then he moves on, next couple chapters, to the town of Lystra. And Lystra he's talking to rural pagans. And in Lystra, he doesn't start with the Jewish scriptures. Nobody would have understood what he was talking about. He doesn't start with the prophecy of the Messiah, but instead, he starts with the people's experience with the general awareness and goodness of God. He said, there's this God who made everything. He's given you rain in its season. He gives you sunshine and so forth. He starts to go on and tell them about how to know this God. Well, his discourse was interrupted by an attack from persecutors. But nevertheless, he started with a different approach, a different starting point, and we know he would have brought it to Jesus. And then in Athens, he's talking to sophisticated urban pagans, and he looks around at all the gods they have, all the shrines they have, and he says, look, here's this shrine. I can see that you're very religious people, you're spiritual people. He says, I see a shrine there to the unknown God. Let me tell you who that is. Let me tell you what you're missing. And so he starts with a starting point, not of the God of creation and of nature, not of the Jewish scriptures, but he starts with their interest and capacity to assimilate into their thinking all these various different gods. And he says, let me tell you who this is. And he connects the dots from this unknown God and from all of the gods they serve to Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. And so that's the contextualization approach, the cross-cultural approach modeled by the Apostle Paul. Now, let's apply this to Mormonism as a cultural identity. See, I want you to understand that Mormonism is not just a religious system. It's not just a church. It's not just an approach. It's not simply a way of believing. But Mormonism is a complete way of life. It's a complete shared cultural identity. Now, part of culture certainly is worldview. Worldview can be defined as what people understand as reality. It includes questions like, is there something above the natural world? What is the essence of human beings? How do they relate to the natural world? How do human beings relate to the supernatural world? And questions like, what's the purpose of life? What's the problem with the world? And what's the solution to that problem? So every human being has answers to those questions. But the default answers that people will go to without even having thought about the answers that they have, the default answers are provided by a person's culture and the worldview that's associated with that culture. And so, certainly, the Latter-day Saint identity does include worldview and beliefs. Certain beliefs that are unique to Mormonism. The idea that God was once a man, a human being who became God, and these somehow related to us genetically. The idea that there are potentially many other gods like him in the universe. The concept that the Bible is corrupted and that new scripture and new revelation is always needed. Or the idea that humans are literal children of God, not just created by God, but begotten by God. Or that everybody goes to some level of heaven when this life is over. And certainly the highest level of heaven, righteous people can become gods themselves. And certainly part of this worldview is that the idea that the church that Jesus founded was lost to a great apostasy spread through the whole world. And like I said earlier, the authority to act in God's name was lost. And how this one true church was restored by Joseph Smith. And so my point is simply that Mormons have a belief system, but I want you to understand that that's not all. They're not completely defined by that belief system. They aren't just people who believe certain things. But they're people who share a deeply rooted identity. Now, I'm generalizing here, and I think there are broad generalities that could apply, that do apply. But within those broad generalities, I also want you to understand that every Latter-day Saint is unique. They're different in their personal beliefs. Not all of them believe all of standard Mormonism. And so, in fact, the church, we'll talk about kind of the way the church approaches that in a little bit. They'll be different in how assimilated they are into LDS culture. If you're living in Utah, if you're living somewhere else where LDS culture is less prominent. We'll talk about, again, regional differences. We'll talk about generational differences. People who are my age experience their Mormonism very differently in some ways than younger Mormons. There's differences between converts to the LDS church and what we call birthright saints, people who are born into it. There's differences between people who have been through the temple ritual. versus people who have never been through the temple. And so those are all things to keep in mind when we talk about the culture, the worldview of Mormonism. So what I want to do next is think about 8 common cultural traits of Latter-day Saints as a people. 8 traits. And again, these are going to differ from one person to another, but they're broad generalities that apply pretty much across the board in some way or another to most Latter-day Saints. And number 1, you're going to find when you interact with LDS people that they have a high view of their LDS identity. They have a high view of the Latter-day Saint religion, and LDS culture. Now, missiologist Charles Kraft observed that high self-esteem cultures can be hard to reach. And that's what we've discovered in Utah in the Mormon world. They're hard to reach because the people lack a sense of need for the gospel, and they lack a sense that anybody else can tell them more truth than they have. So Mormons have this high sense of who they are, our culture, our church. It's really the top of the barrel, so to speak. And the core aspiration that this culture, that this meets in the culture, is that people want to live up to and uphold the high heritage that they've received. And so when you're talking to somebody who's LDS, they think, that LDS church is really important. They want to live up to that. They don't want to surrender any evidence of that. Now, the second cultural trait that I would mention is that LDS people are strongly family-oriented. And you see that all the time. You kind of see a big emphasis in Latter-day Saint marketing material on family. For a long time, they're saying families are forever. You have this eternal piece of family. And so that's really the core aspiration of the culture, is people want to be united as a family for eternity. But they have very strong family values as well in how they live out their family life and how they raise their kids, and all the rest seem to be really strong. That's a big part of the culture. And when you talk to a Latter-day Saint then about coming to faith in Jesus or comparing ideas, they're really in the back of their mind, they're thinking about what's my family going to think, and potential pressure that comes from the family if they don't conform. Also, aspirations. It raises questions for apologetics. Say, what about my parents? They've died. How can I don't want to break, the family for eternity that has been promised. And if I leave the church, I'm breaking that up. So those are some ways that the cultural relevance of family is important. A third trait is that Mormonism promotes personal achievement. Mormonism, the Mormon culture, very much emphasis on achievement, on excellence. There's, in fact, Mormons probably have, I think it's true that they have a higher number of people within the Mormon church who have completed college than any other group. And so they have a lot of people who are involved in business success and involved in success in different endeavors in life, because it promotes this achievement. And that's because the core aspiration of the culture is to prepare in this life for eternal advancement. So the idea of the whole salvational system of Mormonism is all about achievement, in moral achievement in this life and in the life to come. And so related to that one, the Mormon culture, number 4, fosters a perfectionistic lifestyle. So Latter-day Saints are always trying to prove their worthiness for salvation. They're proving it to God, to themselves. They're proving it to other people who are watching. And so the highest salvation, like we said, depends on keeping all of the commandments, on living up to these achievements. And so it's a demanding religion. They can never know when they've done enough. And that becomes a factor. We'll talk about that in the next session, about how it becomes a factor that allows us to share the gospel with people who are beat down and maybe they're having difficulty living up to that standard of worthiness, because the core aspiration of the culture is a desire to be righteous or to be worthy in visible ways that people can see. Now there's a 5th trait of the LDS culture, and that is that they have a unique epistemology. Epistemology is simply the question of how do you know what's true? How do you know what's real and true? So we all have an epistemology. We're all thinking about, I know what's true because an expert says so. I know what's true because it meets the logical test or so forth. But Mormons understand truth through experience. Latter-day Saints will validate the truth through spiritual and emotional experiences. So, for example, people who are investigating the church, thinking of joining the church, are urged to read the Book of Mormon, not so much to master the content of the Book of Mormon, but the promise is that if you read the Book of Mormon and you pray about it with a sincere heart, then God will reveal to you the truth of the Book of Mormon. And the way that they expect Him to reveal that is they're going to receive a warm feeling to prove that it's true. When you get that warm feeling, that sense of a burning in the bosom, they call it, then that's a way to know that what you've been praying about is really true. Now, that connects to the core aspiration of the culture. They're looking for experiences that connect them to God. And so the experience becomes the way that they understand the truth. Now let's talk about a sixth trait of LDS culture, and that is pretty much obvious to everybody who knows any Mormon people. That is, they practice unique dietary restrictions. They forbid alcohol, tobacco, and coffee. Now this is changing somewhat. The church, well, the interpretations of what this means have always been fuzzy or a little bit around the edges. There's certain things that are clear, some things that are less clear, and the practice of this is changing a little bit in the younger generations. And so this might be changing quite a bit, actually, if the church loosens their hold on this area. But for now, you can expect the Latter-day Saint person to have a strong kind of sense of boundaries about certain things. You're not going to invite them over for a drink. You're not going to invite them to go get a beer, right? You're not even going to serve them coffee. And so those are some things that are markers of that culture. A seventh trait of the culture is that they are loyal, very loyal to authority. LDS people are fiercely loyal to their church and to its leaders. That means the current prophet, who's right now is named Russell M. Nelson. The current prophet, very loyal to him, as well as, of course, to Joseph Smith, the original prophet of Mormonism. That loyalty to authority extends to other authorities, to local leaders, the leader of the local ecclesiastical units, also to family patriarchs, your father, grandfather, and so forth. And they're very loyal to the Book of Mormon. And so I've learned over the hard way over the last years that you have to be really careful about not speaking in a way that's derogatory or that denigrates, at least in their mind, any of their leaders. And so it's really careful about how you handle the Book of Mormon, how you speak about it, and how you if you challenge their loyalty, that's something that they're going to go back to as part of their culture. And then the final one that I want to mention is that being Latter-day Saint is driven by activity. You can believe whatever you want to believe about a whole bunch of different things, and if you could keep them to yourself or share them with just a few friends, but if you don't try to undermine the church with those things, then that's okay. What's more important is loyalty and activity, that you believe in the story of Joseph Smith, that you're sold on the prophetic role and calling of Joseph Smith, not necessarily all the details of doctrine. And so because it's based on activity and not theology, then LDS people are kept very, very busy. There's very little time for non-LDS relationships, and that's a challenge for how we share our faith with Latter-day Saints. Now, next we're going to talk about how understanding the culture translates into building relationships with Latter-day Saints. That's how we'll end this session. And then in the second session, we'll drill down with 6 specific pillars which build bridges, 6 principles to communicate with Latter-day Saints that are going to actually build bridges instead of barriers with them. And so I want to talk about what I'm going to call culture-wise tips for redemptive relationships with Latter-day Saints. There's basically 3 things I want you to think about based on the culture that will help you to connect with your Latter-day Saint neighbors and friends. Number 1 is I think it's smart to be careful about your assumptions of them. You got to watch what you're assuming about them. For example, some of us might assume, hey, I know what Mormons believe. Well, that may or may not be true. You might not know what Mormons believe. You might know what Mormonism as a whole might teach, but you never know what an individual believes until they tell you what they believe. So I want you to set that assumption aside. Or you might have this assumption when you hear about some of the unique features of Mormon thought, of the Mormon story, some of us go like, oh, I can't believe they must be crazy to believe that, whatever that is, They must be crazy to believe that Jesus and Lucifer were spirit brothers in the spirit world before this earth. Or they must be crazy to believe that you could have more than one wife. They've got to be an idiot to believe that. So I want to be careful about that assumption, because everything they believe comes out of the context of their life and their culture and their experience. And so, yeah, when it's just raw data, it might be crazy to believe that. But when it's embedded in a whole life experience, it might not be so crazy or so foolish to believe that after all. And then another assumption that a lot of us make about Mormons is that they'll never be interested in biblical Christianity. Mormonism has typically been, like I said, it's got a high view of itself. It's typically been trying to convert people from Christian faith into Mormonism. And we think, oh my gosh, they have this debate going on. They'll never be interested in biblical Christianity. And you know what? I just don't know if that's true in everybody's life. We've seen so many people come out of Mormonism into biblical Christianity. But you're going like, wait, I've been talking to my friend and he just has all these opinions about everything. He can answer. He goes, what about the Bible? We don't believe the Bible. The Bible is not translated accurately. He goes, what about history? And he'll bring up all these issues and all these questions, priesthood and all the rest. And it seems like he's got a pretty good handle on it. But the fact is, I don't really know what's going on inside anybody. And there's something about LDS culture I didn't mention, but it's another factor about LDS culture. Really, it's because of the perfectionism and because of the high achievement orientation that we spoke of, that unless you're living up to it, then you're seen as a second-class citizen. And so if you have a doubt, if you have questions about the beliefs of Mormonism, then you're not likely to go and be vulnerable about that with someone in your ward. You're not going to share, you're not going to ask your questions. You're not going to say, hey man, what about this? I'm not sure I get that, or I'm struggling with this, because that immediately puts you in a lower class category. And so, with that veiled guardedness, that lack of vulnerability that's birthed by this perfectionism and by this conformity, LDS people, they don't really talk about what's going on inside. They might be compiling all kinds of issues that are going to build up in their thinking. And in Mormon parlance, they say, hey, just put that on the shelf. Well, they put another thing on the shelf and another thing on the shelf that they don't understand. And pretty soon, at some point, the shelf will break. And then that's when they make their break with Mormonism. But you might not see that coming. They're not going to share it with anybody. So you don't know what's happening inside your friend. They might be 10 years away from their shelf breaking. They might be 10 hours away. And they won't tell you until it actually happens. And so I want to be careful about the assumptions that we make, especially the assumption that, hey, that person is really never going to be interested in biblical Christianity. The second relational thing that helps us understand how to have relationships with Mormons is I want you to realize how Latter-day Saints may see you and how they're going to relate to you as a non-Mormon, as a non-member of the church. Now, honestly, they can be pretty insular. They can be cloistered together, kind of cocooned together. They stick together because these are people who know how I think, and they believe like I do, and they have values like I do. So, everybody sticks together with their tribe, so to speak, their crowd. But with Mormonism, that means that a lot of LDS people can be relationally self-contained. They don't have a lot of space in their life for new relationships. Now, they might think of you. So they might think of you, say, there's that neighbor's a nice neighbor, whatever. I don't have time because we don't have, we have so many things in our busy, active Mormon schedule to keep up with. I'm not sure I have time for that person. Now, another thing they might look at you is they might look at you as junior varsity Christian. Because they're the one true church, right? They don't believe that people in other faiths and other churches have real spiritual experiences from God. They don't believe that we really know God, that we really have the Holy Spirit. Now, again, their life is very experiential. That's how they know truth. That's a big part of what they have in their relationship with God. There's lots of spiritual experiences in Mormonism, but they don't think those things happen outside of Mormonism, which of course they do. But that's just their stereotype of you. And their perspective of you probably is that you're not as serious about your faith as they are. Because they're very serious people. They're perfectionists. They want to be worthy. All of that adds up. They look at you and you're mowing your lawn on Sunday, or you have casual about certain things, and they think, oh, look at me. I'm way more spiritual than that other person. Now, usually what that reveals is that Latter-day Saints are pretty uninformed about other faiths. And so I hear all the time, LDS people will say, hey, you believe just like we do, or we believe just like you do, right? Well, we believe in a lot of the same moral values and virtues of life. We believe in the very broadest sense that there is a God, there's a person named Jesus, and all that, but they don't really understand what else we believe. They're pretty myopic about the nature of our faith and pretty uninformed about that. And that becomes an opportunity to talk to them. What do you mean by that? Well, here's what I mean by that. Now, realistically, many of them are going to expect you to attack their beliefs. I saw a survey a couple years ago that showed that 50% of, especially the active Latter-day Saints, 50% of them think that evangelical Christians are against them. Now that goes way back. It goes back to early persecution. It goes back to all kinds of change. In our own more recent history, it goes back to when Mitt Romney, the Mormon, was running for president. And a lot of Christians, preachers and stuff, said, no, we can't have a president who's a Mormon. And they felt attacked in that sense. So they think, and Mormon missionaries I've talked to, a lot of them, when they come back from their mission, they all have stories about people who claim to be Christians who treated them poorly. Who shouted at them, yelled at them, who were rude to them on the doorstep, or whatever it might be. And so that all feeds this narrative that they think evangelical Christians are against them. Now, along with that, the other side of that is they want you to see their faith in a positive light. And part of that is self-esteem. They want Mormonism to be seen as legitimate after being on the fringes of society for so long. But it's also partly because they're most likely interested in converting you to Mormonism. And so there's an increasing openness to evangelical faith, not just conversion. This younger generation, they're more interested in understanding more and sharing more. Like I said, they don't really know us very well. But a lot of them are more open to evangelical faith. And some evidence of that, Mormons love The Chosen. The TV series about Jesus. They love The Chosen. And everything that's in there, The Chosen, is not like directly word for word from Scripture, but it portrays a biblical Orthodox view of Jesus, I believe. It doesn't really create a Mormon view of Jesus. Mormons are very interested in contemporary Christian music. Mormons love K-Love, the contemporary Christian music chain that's all over the country. Mormons tune into that a ton. In Salt Lake area, when there's a Christian artist or group that comes through and plays in the local stadium, there's tons of Mormons who come to that event. And Latter-day Saints, especially LDS women, are very, very interested in Bible study. Well, you and I would sit down in a Bible study group. We'd open the Bible. We'd say, here, what does it say? How do we interpret it? And so forth. Mormon women especially are very interested in that process. And they're really willing to invest and take time to study the Bible with Christian friends. The thing is, they're interested in those three things because those are things that are not offered in their own system. They don't get much of Jesus in their system. They don't have a sense of worship and transcendence of God in their system. And they don't really study the Bible. They study church-related materials. So all those things create opportunity for us to engage Latter-day Saints, because that's how they see us. They see us maybe in some negative ways, but they also see things that we believe in and that we practice in some very positive ways that creates opportunity for us, I think. And then the third thing about a culture-wise way to build a redemptive relationship with Latter-day Saint is simply, this is true for everybody who doesn't know Jesus, but simply be willing to enter their world. You got to be willing to get out of your Christian bubble. And that might mean taking the initiative because, again, they're fully engaged in their world. They got all the relationships that they want. So I might have to take the initiative to break through and be invitational and invite them over to my place to find common ground with them. You know, what that common ground might be, it depends on who you and your neighbor are. But in 1 Corinthians 9, in verse 19, Paul says, even though I am a free man with no master, I have become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those who follow the Jewish law, I too lived under that law. Even though I'm not subject to the law, I did this so I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. And when I am with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from that law, so I can bring them to Christ. But I do not ignore the law of God. I obey the law of Christ. When I'm with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and share in its blessings. So in verse 22 Paul says, I try to find common ground with everyone. He's adaptable and he explains how that works with people of different religious cultures and how far he can adapt and how far he can't adapt to meet with those people. And so with Latter-day Saints, you know, I said they're big on family. And so one way to find common ground is family, is parenting, doing stuff together as families, sharing together, asking them how their kids are doing and so forth. Another way to find common ground with a lot of Latter-day Saints is sports. Sports is big in LDS culture. Another way is to think of the hobbies that I have. And instead of just doing my hobbies with Christians, what if I include people who aren't Christians? So I ride my bicycle a lot. So why don't I go find ways to partner up with other guys who aren't Christians to ride our bikes together? There might be neighborhood issues that you face, like the neighborhood is facing an opportunity or there's a challenge. Then those are common ground that you can use to build relationships and invite LDS people into your world. And then, of course, once they come into your world, then what do? Well, I ask a lot of questions. And ask simple questions, not like questions that are going to make it super awkward at first, but questions about them. I'm going to ask, what matters to you? What traditions do you do as a family? You know, tell me about your story of how you came to live in this community. And tell me about your kids and how did you grow up? Where did you grow up? Questions that unlock them and your willingness to hear from them and to know them. And so as you invite them into your life, then you're willing to connect with their life. You see, you're willing to go into their life sometimes. They might invite you to church. And I would say, go to church with them. That gives you an opportunity maybe to invite them back to your church. But it also helps you understand more about their world and how they live and how they think. So Sally and I, my wife, we had a Christmas open house one year where we invited all of our neighbors. And a lot of the Latter-day Saint neighbors came. And we created a kind of a bond and a connection with those who came. Our neighbors had a 4th of July party last year. And we said, we're going to go to that. We're going to connect with people. We're going to show up. And we're invited, so we're going to show up. Another way to connect with their world is just to be a good neighbor. And that means to serve your neighbors. You know, if you see a need in your neighborhood, on your street, you go for it. But here's the other thing. It means willing to be served. Because Mormons are the only ones who think they serve a lot, right? So they do. They're great people. They serve in their neighborhoods a ton. They're doing practical things that need to be done. But I also want to be served, to receive their service, because that says something about how I honor them and how open I am to their influence in my life and their relationship with them. But we serve. My wife walked the elderly neighbor's dogs. He was ill for quite a time. She walked his dogs every day. Now, here's the thing. I mentioned earlier that struggling Latter-day Saints cannot be vulnerable within their own community. But as you connect with them, find common ground, enter their lives, invite them into your life, I believe that a caring Christian friend can be the safe place that they need. When the wheels come off in their life, when the shelf breaks, who are they going to tell? How about someone that they've developed trust with, someone that they know cares about them? They're going to share those things with you, and that gives you the credibility to share back your hope in Jesus as well. And so enter their world. I would just say this: you got to stay connected to your own faith support system in your own community as well. And that would be important when you're entering their world. Okay, so again, in the next session, we're going to talk about how to have great conversations with Latter-day Saints about spiritual issues and how to do it in a way that builds bridges and not barriers, based on the culture of Mormonism. And so thanks for checking this out, and I look forward to talking to you guys again in the next session.